mic break. Do I want a solid red light?
Yes.
Oh dear.
That's better.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, onliners. I didn't get the signal. Okay. We'll have to just hit the ground running for those of you tuning in. I've forgotten where I was. Bante. Importance.
Friends to many people.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So he was a friend, he was a preceptor, he ordained many, many people, gave them their names, initiated them, if you like, into a Buddhist life. But one of his main functions is simply he was a teacher. And one of the things that meant is he gave lots and lots and lots of lectures. I haven't counted them, even that would take a long time, but there are hundreds. I've got my one I'm doing this evening called The Buddha's Victory off freebuddhistaudio.com. Easy website to remember. You can get them all there. But there's a lifetime of teachings in them, really. So that's part of his little potted life of Sangharakshita, or potted importance of Sangharakshita. And he gave this talk, The Buddha's Victory, in 1987. I think it's either 86 or 87. I failed to write it down earlier. Pretty long speaking and teaching career. That would have started in India in the 1940s. He started communicating the Dharma not that long after he himself came across the Dharma, which is a bit of a teaching in itself. We'll go into that in the Buddhist life later. But part of his practice of the Dharma was teaching, speaking, clarifying points in communication with people. Anyway, his lecturing career started in the 1940s, and in the 60s and 70s at least, he was doing it all the time. In the 80s, somewhat, and leading a lot of study retreats and so on. And there are talks by him recorded in the 90s, noughties, and probably a few brief recorded appearances from whatever you call the decade that's just finished, the 2010s. So really, heaps of jewels really to go into, and we're just going to be picking 4 or 5 over the next weeks, and saying why we appreciate them and what we think is in them for us. Okay, so the one I've picked is the Buddha's Victory. I won't say why just yet, but I thought we could pause there, right at the title, and we might not get through the whole thing, but we will get further than the title. And I thought I'd just see what response you have to that title, The Buddha's Victory. Because he might be saying something even with the title, if you see what I mean. What do you make of that? Do type in the chat if you're at home.
Is it conquering Mara?
Yeah, conquering Mara. Yeah, that's sort of. We'll go into some specifics like that later. Yeah. Becoming enlightened. Yeah. Why might that be called a victory?
I guess because no one else is enlightened.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean that in a comparative sense. I don't mean that in the sense of better than others. I mean it in the sense of overcoming something that others have not overcome. Like the hindrances.
Yeah. Yes, so overcoming something and doing something unique. Yeah. I don't suppose you'd still even then have to call it victory, if you like. So should we go into that a little bit more? I think Henry, you were first.
Well, when he left the palace, he wanted to overcome suffering.
Yeah.
Presumably he found a way to do that, and that's a victory.
Okay, so the Buddha leaving the palace to overcome suffering is a victory. So maybe let's come back to what... No, let's keep going, actually, associations with victory and the Buddha's victory. Yeah,
because it's not his overcoming or his survival. I think there's something quite jubilant about the term victory.
Yeah, jubilant.
Celebratory.
Yeah, great. And then Jessica, you go.
Concrete.
Jessica, you go. Yeah.
It's unexpected because victory you associate with ego
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a little bit provocative,
Yeah.
could we say, because it's got associations we might not normally have with spiritual life's peacefulness. Yeah.
Exactly. It almost feels like one of those expressions which is like bittersweet or something.
Right.
isn't it? So,
Yes.
yeah.
So it might be designed to make it sound as though it has a contradiction in it,
Yeah.
Buddha and victory, and we'll look at whether it does. But Peter, did you have something or no?
Well, I thought the mind, just conquering the mind.
Conquering the mind. Why would you talk about conquering the mind?
Oh, because it just feels right.
Fair enough.
Sorry.
I'll have to take that one. Feels right. Conquering the mind. Yeah. Yeah.
The first word that came to my mind was battle.
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of conquering or overcoming, I don't know, return, victory.
Yeah. So battle.
The mind.
What sort of battle? Yeah.
Well,
What?
it's internal.
Uh-huh. An internal battle. A battle in the mind. Yeah.
I think there's an element of permanence about victory. It's not you're winning, it's actually that you've won.
Ah. Okay.
There's no going back.
Yeah. I might even add my own word in, which is irreversible. Yeah. So, anyway, it can't be undone. Let's say. Yeah. Great. Good. Yeah. What it suggests to me is that there must be somewhere an enemy. If you see what I mean. I like what you added in, saying there's something jubilant about it, because victory is also actually a happy word, isn't it? It's got warlike associations, but actually, as you said, a celebratory one too. But immediately it suggests there's some adversary. There's a victor and a... Well, I don't suppose there's a victim, actually. Anyway, that's the wrong word. Somebody has won. Somebody has triumphed or overcome something. At least met adversity and overcome it. So I'm sure that's obvious enough by now. But as Jessica was saying, not normally the associations we might have if we look at somebody who's already overcome it, to pick up on what Paul said. If we simply look at a Buddha or think about a Buddha, he might be on the other side of the important bits that we're going to be looking at, and it's, in a way, that stuff that matters, how you get onto the other side of it. Yeah, good. So, Sangharakshita opens the lecture by saying that Buddha Day, the festival where we celebrate the Buddha's enlightenment, is often called Buddha Jayanti, which means something like celebration of the Buddha's victory. So it's quite traditional, actually. He's decided to pick it out and, if you like, provoke us with it a little bit, but it's in quite traditional Buddhist language from early on. And in the lecture, if you like, he's picking a certain aspect of things to emphasise. So there's tons of ways you could look at enlightenment. Really, this is a lecture saying, what is enlightenment? He did that in lots and lots of ways and lots of lectures. So in this one, he's taking enlightenment as victory and saying victory over what? So I'll give the game away a bit and read the list of things he goes through that have been triumphed over in the Buddha's mind. So the group and its conditionings, spiritual ambition and spiritual complacency, fear, refusal to admit that we've made a mistake, all four maras, and spiritual individualism. Okay, so it's quite specific. You don't need to remember all the items on that list. It's another Buddhist list. But this is what he's saying gives us a way into the enlightened mind, which really is ineffable, inexpressible, very difficult to grasp, which is sort of relevant in the story. Okay, so let's see a bit of what he says. So Peter said that there's a victory over Mara. I don't know if why don't you raise your hand if you've got some idea of who or what Mara is. Mara, that means something medium. Yeah, medium. Okay. he goes into 4 different Maras in this lecture, so it gets a little bit complicated, but let's just conjure up briefly the one that's most colourful in the story. Basically, when the Buddha has tasted a life simply of pleasure and unreality in the palace and decided to leave that and seek the truth, realised that austerities and self-mortification wasn't the way either. By and by, he sits under a particular tree and says, I won't get up until I have completely discovered and penetrated the middle way that must transcend those alternatives. And one of the last things that happens before his complete breakthrough is that Mara, who's a kind of devil of the Buddhist stories, really doesn't want this to happen, comes up to him, deploys an army of spirits and ghouls and goblins that hurls spears and rocks at the Buddha, and as those spears and rocks fall into the golden light surrounding the Buddha, they just become a rain of flowers. Mara gets exasperated, deploys his next weapon, which is beautiful, seductive daughters, who he asks to dance in front of the Buddha and tempt him. The Buddha's completely uninterested. Mara tries one more thing, which is doubt, so just comes up to him himself, sort of final one-to-one kind of face-off, and says, who are you to think you can achieve full and perfect enlightenment? Kind of who do you think you are, really? Playing on any last lack of confidence he can find. So it's said that doubt is the last thing to go, because the Buddha expresses his confidence, if you like, in his practice and the efforts he's made. And the earth goddess, when he touches the earth, springs up to bear witness to this. And Mara sort of wilts into the background, and he comes back into the story a few times later as a slightly ridiculous figure, but he's finished as a significant foe by then. So there's a victory over Mara. That's the well-known one. It's depicted very often in images. It makes kind of a good story. You could embellish it in lots of different ways. I've told it very briefly there. But where Sangharakshita's lecture really gets going is he says, that's probably the one you've heard of. Let's bear in mind it's not the only one. So he goes into his own list, and he says that the going forth, where the Buddha leaves the palace, is actually the first in a series of small victories. And then he clarifies that they're only really small victories in the context of the life of a Buddha to be, and that for most of us those would be quite significant victories. So that's when the Buddha, as a young, attractive man, has absolutely everything he wants, is basically bored and disillusioned with it, sees through it, in language we'd use today, tunes into and values his own sense of dissatisfaction and decides to make use of it and act on it and go in search of something more substantial. And Sangharakshita says that really is the first victory in the sequence. Described as the going forth. He says, suppose you were young, healthy and good looking. Suppose too you were happily married, perhaps with a child. Would you have found it easy to give it all up? Would you have been able to go forth for the sake of you knew not what? For the sake of the quotes truth, for the sake of something higher, something beyond anything you had yet experienced or imagined? This is exactly what Siddhartha, the Buddha to be, actually did. So he's saying, let's not sort of fast forward over that bit of the story where he gives up actually some of the strongest attachments in a human life because he feels that they aren't going to lead him ultimately to the truth. Okay, you can get into debates about this part of the story. He seems to leave a wife and a child in some later elaborations. Actually, the original text is very, very simple. Only mentions his parents with tears streaked down their faces, and mentions that it was against their will that the Buddha left the palace. I won't read the quote, but he leaves a comfortable life, basically, and all of the worldly gifts. And here's the reason I think this is would be a big victory for us as long as we knew how to use it. All of the worldly gains and gifts that actually much of humanity spends its energy chasing after were not good enough for him. They weren't it, if you see what I mean. So security, happiness, love, I don't know, a fortunate situation, wealth, huge wealth, not satisfying. He's not saying he didn't like it. He probably did like it for quite a few years, as far as we know. It was said to leave home when he was 29, so it did go on for a while. But he's thinking, ultimately, this isn't going to give me satisfaction. Okay, so that's the first victory, and Bante's saying to us, would we find that easy? The way he glosses it is saying, this is a victory in a deeper sense than just leaving a comfortable situation as well. It's a victory over his attachment to the group, and that this did not just mean leaving the group, but overcoming group attitudes and conditioning. Maybe let's just again stop here for a minute or two. What do you think might be meant here? Group attitudes and conditioning. That's the thing he's really going forth from and managed to tear himself away from. Any guesses?
I think all the expectations,
Oh, yeah.
for example, his parents had,
Yeah.
his wife had,
Yeah.
maybe his kid had,
Yeah.
and he did that step and opened up like a complete new space to see what else is there.
Expectations, yeah, good. Quite a weight, quite a force in life, yeah.
And also, if you're sort of at the pinnacle of society, if you have things that other people strive for, by leaving them behind, you're not just leaving your physical possessions. You're making a very big statement about what's important that contradicts everything. It was tantamount to lunacy, probably, the people around him. Like, why would you leave that? So there's quite a big kind of. I imagine that's a difficult thing to do because there'd be a lot of judgment. That feeling of who am I to say? It's ungrateful. There was a lot of complexity emotionally there.
Yes, exactly. So quite often what we fear when we do something is other people's responses, isn't it? The willingness to be unpopular, do something that possibly nobody around us agrees with, already calls up or demands quite a lot of courage, I think. I know this myself only too well. Sometimes before we act, even just thinking about acting, already we're calculating what will people think. I mean, what will people think? It's a huge force in our lives. I hope I'm not the only one. A couple of nods, yeah.
Something like with the worldly winds.
Yeah.
And being kind of blown about by them. Because that's something that we learn from the group.
The group and worldly winds. Well, let's say the worldly winds. That's a set of sort of eight forces in the world. Praise and blame would be the pair I'd sort of pick there. You've also got a pair of worldly winds, sometimes called fame and infamy. But fame and infamy are problems for so few people that I prefer another translation I've come across, which is status and disgrace. Actually, I should have thought of this. Status is really what he's going forth from. That's what many of us are caught up in much of the time, is what are we seen to have or do or be. And he's just completely uninterested. In the story, when he reaches the boundary of his father's property, he exchanges clothes with a beggar. And that's really saying, I now have no class, no caste, no finery. I won't be seen to... people won't value me based on nice clothes, if you see what I mean, which is, even that might be more than we sort of think. I don't know if anyone's ever done something that involved like putting on, I don't know. I used to work as a waiter sometimes when I was young, and it's amazing how people just related to you like that. You see what I mean? As soon as you got that shirt thing on and the aprony thing, people just sort of treat you a certain way. And you kind of get this feeling like, hey, I'm a whole person here, kind of thing. It's some, I don't know, some drunk guy at a horse race. You know what I mean? Kind of, people see you and just they decide who you are, if you see what I mean. Sometimes just based on the shirt you're wearing. Is giving up. Well, it's not giving up that. It's going into that, if you like. It's sort of giving up all respectability. That's probably what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Someone in the chat saying freedom from conditionality. No, conditioning. Sorry.
Freedom from conditioning. Yeah. Yes. So I think that's what we're discussing really. That particularly in terms of when we say conditioning of the group, I think a lot of what we mean is people's expectations, what they'll think, and our own response to that. Of course, a lot of the time, what we do is rather blame the expectations of others, but of course, they may or may not have those. What might be the real issue is that we value them, if you see what I mean. We value the expectations of others or want to meet them or have some other reaction to them. Anyway, so that's the group, and that's one way he says to look at the going forth as an actual victory. It's not just exchanging clothes with a beggar. It's saying he's actually triumphed over status now. Okay, so let's see what happens next. So having gone forth from home into homelessness, which is usually what the tradition calls it, he meets a couple of meditation teachers. So he's searching for the truth. Groups of wandering sadhus and beggars and meditators are around the place, and comes across two different groups at different times. His first two real teachers, and to cut a long story short, he basically attains exactly what both teachers have attained quite quickly. The teachers, to their credit in the story, quite quickly recognise that this man Siddhartha has attained everything they themselves have attained. One of them offers him joint leadership of their meditators community, the first one. The second one offers him entire leadership and offers to step down himself, if you see what I mean. So you've actually got others in the story giving up their own status to sort of make way for somebody whose growth is sort of accelerating more and more. Anyway, the victory story here is that Siddhartha is not interested. Let's get a bit of detail on this. Siddhartha had experienced for himself everything that his teachers had to teach. That's already quite a statement, isn't it? Imagine arriving at that point. Imagine coming to the London Buddhist Centre and, everything. I'm not talking about myself here, but Bhante, let's say, it's just I've now realised everything that he has to teach. Siddhartha experienced for himself everything that his teachers had to teach, but he knew that there was still something beyond, something higher, which he had not yet realised, and which he wanted to realise. He knew that he was not yet fully enlightened, despite what his teachers were telling him. So imagine that. Imagine if a teacher is being as encouraging as that, and you actually disagree. They're saying you've basically arrived. You've arrived at the goal. Not much more to learn, or nothing more to learn. And he disagrees himself. He did not settle down with a limited spiritual experience, even though by ordinary standards it was quite a high one. In this way, he overcame spiritual complacency. So there again, we sort of hop from the Buddha story perhaps back into our own. Most of us probably haven't had that type of experience in the story. But I like this new sentence, he overcame spiritual complacency. Complacency being now an ordinary word, we're back in the ordinary sphere. And I think, oh yeah, we probably can recognise that. I know a lot of the time, a lot of us will be doubting ourselves or thinking, I find meditation very difficult, or I haven't really got anywhere. But probably, and this is culturally harder to admit, I would argue, we've had little pockets in our mind where we've decided that we have actually done really quite well. Or even that we don't have that much more to learn. That we've basically done it. Like we've gone on some really strong retreat, and that's basically that now. I've been on my intensive meditation retreat and really socked it to them, and my mind is really open, and you don't notice you're doing it, and it's not like you'd actually argue it in court, but somewhere for us emotionally we can decide that we've reached the extent of something, spiritual complacency. Anyway, so he decides not to settle down in that, but then consider this next step. He says no thank you to leading those communities. So he's quite uninterested in leadership, Bhante says. He was concerned with truth. He was concerned with enlightenment. And in this way he overcame spiritual ambition as well. Just to clear up that term, I suppose he means ordinary ambition there, expressed in the spiritual life. You see what I mean? Because you could say, when I see that phrase, spiritual ambition, I think, well, that sounds quite good actually. That must mean wanting to attain things spiritually. He's saying, I'm not interested in any admixture into the spiritual of some desire to advance myself. Okay, so that is, the second victory over spiritual ambition and complacency. So then, not for the first time, the Buddha finds himself on his own again. Recurring theme in the Buddha's story is him finding himself on his own, even if he's surrounded by others. There's loads and loads of places in the story where you can find either physical and spiritual aloneness, or simply spiritual aloneness. Part of the unique individuality of the Buddha is what's being got at here with the complacency point of him thinking, I personally feel convinced that there is further to go here, something else that can be found. Whether or not others agree, I'm going to continue down this road. It's a sort of uncontaminated confidence that I think would be hard to have. So once he's left in the palace, I think he probably is experiencing some existential aloneness. He's thinking, all these pleasures going on around me, all these tents and gardens and festivals and flowers, I'm not into it. Personally, that's the kind of loneliness I personally could tune into. Probably we've all found ourselves in situations where we're surrounded by some sort of excitement, energy, people, and thought, yeah, but I don't feel connected to it. Anyway, then he finds himself physically alone, having left the palace, the episode with the teachers, but he wants to move on from that, so again he's alone. Goes into the forest, and then the new adversary now is internal, and it's simply fear. So this is in India, covered in much more vegetation than now, for obvious reasons, much less rule of law, and in the jungles you would have had not just tigers and poisonous snakes, but actually robbers and bandits and murderers. The jungle itself conjured fear for people, almost automatically, as far as I can tell. And fear and terror arose. Let me see what Bante's got to say about that. Furthermore, he stayed in what we would call haunted places, places inhabited, at least according to popular belief, by ghosts and spirits, places in which feelings of fear and terror were likely to arise. And those feelings of panic, fear and terror did arise in his mind. And he asks, what did Siddhartha do on those occasions? So fear and terror and panic were arising. And what did he do? Does anyone know? There was a hint in the first half of the class.
I think when he was sitting, he continued sitting.
Mm-hmm.
Was lying, he continued lying.
Yeah.
Standing was also in the game.
Yeah, the standing was also in the game, yeah. Exactly. So if the fear and terror arose while he was walking to and fro, he continued walking to and fro, so he did continue doing that, and then he adds, until he overcame them. He did not run away, did not try to escape from those feelings, similarly if they arose while he was sitting still, etc. If they arose while he was sitting still or while he was lying down, then that is where he faced them and overcame them. In this way he was victorious over fear. So I think there's a couple of things being said there. Not only does he, in the contemporary parlance, feel the fear and do it anyway. I think that's a Buddhist book somewhere. So continue sitting or walking or standing, which are already, you're already having to master very, very intense feelings. That if we're talking about real fear, not just a passing anxiety, actual fear, the instinctive, animalistic, your body's on fire with hormones and blood pumping kind of fear. Not only does he continue doing what he's doing, but he says that is where he faced them and overcame them. I find that interesting. So it's not just that you don't run away, it's not just that you feel fear, it's that by neither running away or failing to feel it, that is where and how you overcome it, if you see what I mean. We talk often about feeling our feelings, which, as long as it doesn't become a sort of goal, as long as it remains a sort of method, is part of our version of this, if you like. But I think it's worth stopping to just acknowledge quite what fear is, quite how strong fear actually is. Probably a lot of us, most of the time, don't have to experience very much of it. And I mean raw fear, where you believe that your life is actually threatened. I hope that we don't feel it very often. Maybe you've had a taste of it though, and it's quite a different order of thing. So this part of the story is saying he didn't just feel that, he actually triumphed over it, basically by not reacting to it. And I like this sense of the word victory. One of my associations with that is something very physically active. Victory sounds like something that someone's either run a marathon or fought in a war to attain. Do you see what I mean? Here you've got somebody sitting perfectly still to attain it, which I think is probably more challenging. Very, very intense, and of course in a way a lot subtler than just going hell for leather with some effort of physical energy. Okay, so that's the victory over fear. So Bhante says, if we face it, we will eventually overcome it. So that's really the key of what he's saying, that running away from a fear, which is what we'll often do, it will basically continue. So facing it is the way to overcome it. Okay, so the next chapter is where he does, again, start to attain a bit of renown. So in these solo journeys through the jungle, again, you can tell he's making quite a lot of progress. So he's got no reaction to threats to his life, basically, to that internal, complete and utter turmoil of, the plane plummeting through the sky, if you see what I mean. No grasping during that experience. Of course, others start to admire his practice and collect around him, and they want to practice with him. And what they get into is some extreme practices that were around at the time, sometimes just known as austerities, sometimes called self-mortification. There's details in the scripture of what people did, and you may have come across all this before. It involved things like holding your breath for a very, very long time, or until passing out. For some reason, forcing the upper and lower teeth together extremely hard for long periods of time. Going without food for a very, very long time. Basically trying to kill off the experience of the body to attain something completely immaterial in the mind. This sort of had I was going to say for better or worse, but no, for better in the end. Siddhartha was very good at this. He actually started getting famous for quite how good he was at it, and effectively leading a small group of people practicing austerities. Nearly died, and then decided that this was the wrong path. His 5 friends, when he took solid food, left him in disgust and said, as Maitreya Bandhu put it yesterday, you've become a softie. He had a mouthful of rice pudding or whatever, and his friends ditched him, said, that's it, you've gone over to the dark side, we're off, and kept going because they wanted to do their extreme extreme things. And so Siddhartha at this point is saying, I did get that wrong, that's not the way. And this is probably one of the best points, I think, in the lecture. Bhante says, on the face of it, this might look like a defeat, but actually it was a great victory. On this instance, Siddhartha had overcome the very human tendency to refuse to admit that one has made a mistake, that one has been on the wrong path, and that one must now retrace one's steps and start all over again. Maybe he's meeting the same test here on a deeper level that the meditation teachers gave him by saying, oh, maybe you'd like to be in charge here and, have a following. At this point, he's only got 5 friends. They're very emaciated guys, basically walking around starving themselves. He says to them, actually, I'm going this way, even if you're still going that way, and they leave him in disgust. So he says he did not mind losing his disciples. He did not mind being on his own yet again. So I thought this was particularly good because, again, with challenges in spiritual life, we might like to think that they're going to involve great heroic feats externally. And sometimes it probably will. I used to really like hearing about the Tibetan culture of doing a solitary retreat for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, and possibly 3 days on the end. I can't remember. Yeah, 3 years, etc. Watched a brilliant film called Samsara. I'd really recommend it, actually. There's 2 films called Samsara, and I've only seen one of them. But anyway, the one I've seen starts with some friends from a monastery going to get a guy who's emerging from his 3-year, 3-month solitary. Very, very long scene of this man effectively being sort of woken up from a very, very long meditation, brought out of the cave into the light for the first time in 3 years, having his hair and beard cut for him, and then falling asleep on a horse, being carried on a horse through these very beautiful landscapes. Wonderful film, and a course that's just so exciting, thinking, God, a 3-year solitary, in a cave. I don't think I was ever in danger of doing one, but that kind of lit up my imagination for a while and at the time. But yeah, looking at this lecture again and this point about admitting having made a mistake, I thought, what is actually difficult in the day-to-day practice of our lives, if we're not realistically going to go on a 3-year solitary and come back to a sort of hero's welcome, how do you get the ego to die? If you see what I mean, if you can't take it to a cave for 3 years, or you don't want to, or you're frankly not up to it, you do things like admit that you've made a mistake, probably apologise if it's affected people, but at least do that awful kind of mini death of saying, even though I insisted on this for a long time, even though I was doing really well, even though I tried to persuade other people of it, let's say, even if I just stuck to my guns for absolutely ages, whoops, actually I was wrong. Very, very difficult to do. And probably a kind of austerity we could look for in our own lives, I would argue. Okay, so that's the fourth victory, the refusal to admit a mistake. I'm going to go quickly through the next one, which is victory over all 4 maras, partly because it's slightly complicated what all the maras are. There's a discussion here about whether Mara, this sort of devil of the Buddhist tradition, is a person or not, or is it a force, or is it a sort of externalization of mental states, like hatred in the rain of rocks and arrows, like lust with the beautiful daughters, or like doubt with the one-on-one with Mara, where he says, who are you to achieve this state? As a sort of a discussion of what do we really mean there by Mara, and if you like, does Mara exist? But one type of Mara, for example, is simply death. So while he's a figure, and at times in the tradition even a ridiculous figure, Mara is actually from a word that simply means death. The fact that things end, the fact that even if you feel you've managed to assemble a life that works, eventually along will come death, and if you like, take all that apart again. So by going beyond the mind's conditions that produce things like negative mental states, Bhante says the Buddha has actually conquered death in that way. He's become victorious over death. It doesn't mean, of course, that he won't die. Of course, the Buddha has one final death, the death of his physical body. It's more that he's conquered this existential situation by getting out of the conditions in the mind that trap us in the tradition in one rebirth after another, because we cannot let go of certain cravings and neuroses and wishes for it to go better next time. Just one quick reflection on this, perhaps. In terms of, as the tradition calls it, overcoming death, which sounds odd because we know that death is coming anyway and even comes to a Buddha, although it's very mysterious what that really means, the Buddha's final passing away. I was on a solitary retreat not so long ago myself, and I was having a certain kind of fantasy about my future life. I dreamed up a sort of slightly different life situation for myself, a slightly different job, living in a different place, ideally kind of meant to be all other expressions of my membership of the order, my practice of Buddhism, I don't know, deepening friendships, all that sort of stuff. But basically, accidentally on my solitary, I got into quite an extended fantasy of this kind. And I only realised when I stepped off, and I noticed that I kept picking it up. It was like my favourite little toy on this solitary retreat. It was ridiculous. At the better moments of the solitary, I managed to really do nothing, including with the mind, as in not start chattering to myself about my experience. I'd just sit in a chair, look out the window, or even look at a bit of furniture or whatever, and really just not add things to it. But when I did, when I got up to make a meal again or went for a walk, it inward charged this sort of exciting kind of revisioning of my future, and a slightly glossier, probably more spiritually successful version of myself would just come back onto the stage, and I'd give it another buff and another detail or two. And it took me coming off the retreat and talking to a friend to realise that what I think I was doing there was taking another rebirth mentally. So a solitary retreat, I sometimes like to think, it is quite an interesting situation to be in, because it's not just that you've got no responsibilities. I mean, it's really the way to taste absolutely no responsibilities, not even a responsibility for communicating with another person, and the sort of, I don't know, stimulation of your energies that can produce. You go into your own kind of whole world, a completely fascinating thing. But nobody can even see you. If you see what I mean, nobody can even see you on solitary. And something in us is finding that very challenging, because it means basically socially we're dead. For other people, you're not even there, if you see what I mean. I don't know, you could be doing anything right now and they wouldn't know. They could be doing anything right now, you wouldn't know on a solitary. Very, very unusual situation. And I think something in the ego cannot handle that, because it suggests to the ego a little bit of non-existence, a little bit of like, are you actually what you think you are? Are you actually sort of really there in the way that you think most of the time, now that all of the external reinforcement of that is taken away? And anyway, that's my story really about rebirth in this life, and possibly what the tradition might mean when the physical death actually comes, and that grasping of the mind has not been overcome. So you're saying, I want to do it again, I want to do it a bit better, I want to be a bit sort of better off in various ways, I want to come across better. You know, actually, eventually you catch yourself basically creating a future you that might have grown a little bit, but then starts to gather to itself like iron filings towards a magnet, worldly gains all over again. And if you like, you're not back in the palace of the Buddha to be exactly, but you're back in a situation that you'll have to go forth from And that is what the Buddha has overcome by overcoming Mara, including the Mara of death. Because that means that death would no longer mean you're in that place that you can't quite handle and you grasp back onto life again. Okay. So that in very brief is the victory over all four Maras. And then one more, I won't quote anymore, one more very important victory. Actually, there's one quote I want to find. This is the best bit. Okay. It's through this victory that he says the Buddha has overcome the Buddha and therefore become truly the Buddha. So I'll say what's meant there. The Buddha has now had his breakthrough in the story, let's say. So you're back to the beginning of the Mara story, the rocks and spears. He's broken through all of these barriers, become this radiant new type of figure that's indefinable, that we represent on our shrines. And he thinks, what I've achieved is so subtle and hard to grasp, and that took so many different kinds of effort and so much effort and such a lot of sort of, he didn't put it like this, but such a lot of sort of applied wisdom and discernment and intelligence and sensitivity, and all of those other victories, like not even pride, not even status, etc. I think that was so hard to attain that basically people won't get it. And I think trying to communicate this would be, I think he says, troublesome and wearying. And the gods hear this thought, and Brahma Sahampati, whose name means Lord of the Thousand Worlds, manifests because of the sort of great poignancy for Brahma Sahampati of the fact that this breakthrough, now that the eternal has kind of intersected with the temporal and conjoined, if you like, with a human body and become manifest in the world, he thinks that light could go out again. And how sad would that be? So anyway, he appears in front of the Buddha and says, there are some people who will understand. He says, with but little dust in their eyes. In the end, the Buddha agrees with the fact that perhaps some people will get it. And I like to think it can't quite be that he didn't get that and he was simply wrong and thought nobody will get it, and then a few minutes later he thought, actually you're right, a few people will get it. I think probably his mind is turning from, can this be done, to, I want it to be done. Thinking, is this really possible, to, if I can find even a crack in the door, I will use it. A crack in the door that lets a little bit of light in. If anybody could get even close to this, I do want to be in communication with them, in the hope that that might work. And the rest of the story, which we'll do another day, is where he does then go about communicating this thing. Some of you might have heard more about that yesterday. And he agrees with Brahma Sahampati's request, saying, opened for those who hear are the doors to the deathless Brahma. Let them give forth their faith. But he's saying, if they can put enough heart into this, I will meet them there and try to communicate this. And Bhante says that is the victory over spiritual individualism, which makes the Buddha a Buddha. It's the completion of the Enlightenment, in another way of saying it, which is why I don't quite believe that it really needs a Brahma Sahampati to come from the outside and say, oh, go on, please, if you see what I mean. He's actually, it brims over, it's, if you like, filled him up, and finally brims over into the world, saying, I'm gonna give this, because the fulfillment of this experience will be encountering it in somebody else, which is actually a point of the story which the Buddha, one of the rare moments where he seems to get excited because he says something twice in a row, when his, again, disciple Kondanya understands, i.e. becomes enlightened. He says, Kondanya knows, and lots of levels of worlds shake with the significance of it. But what Bhante says is giving up there, and becoming victorious over is simply basically the wish to practice for yourself, the wish to keep the enlightenment for himself and say, that's valuable, I wanted that, and it's achieved. And actually, with that perspective, you can see there's almost a disappointment there in the story, and you can see what Brahma Sampati might have felt. All of that work and all of those small or very large victories, right up to this point of becoming a radiant golden Buddha whose aura can turn rocks and spears into flowers, saying, that's all very well then, and I'll now live happily ever after. I suppose, I don't know how the story would end, but we wouldn't know about it, would we? The story would have disappeared. We wouldn't be here now. Okay. So, I think part of what Bhante is sort of trying to tease out in this lecture is that spiritual life is far from easy, does involve many, many kinds of struggle, huge effort, as well as that sort of applied wisdom and intelligence I was talking about. That in the end, what we want really as Buddhists is victory. Victory over all of those, if you like, spiritual enemies that we will meet along the way, for certain. He picks up on the fact that another word for Buddha is jina, which means conquering one. You may have come across the mandala of 5 Buddhas, which are sort of coloured emanations of the Buddha mind. They're called the 5 jinas, or conquerors. So he even says, we're usually called Buddhists, but we could be called jinists. And he's basically warning against too gentle or too pacifist a view of spiritual life. So I'll just finish by giving you that in his words. So he says, for this reason, Western Buddhists should beware of taking too soft a view of the spiritual life. Perhaps we do not meditate hard enough, study hard enough, work hard enough, even play hard enough. Perhaps we have not committed ourselves to the 3 jewels with sufficient depth and intensity. He means here, if we slightly shrink from this description of enlightenment, victory, vanquishing enemies in the spiritual sense, perhaps we haven't committed ourselves with sufficient intensity. Perhaps we do not really want to spread the Dharma. Perhaps we are just playing at being Buddhists. If that is the case, we will not get very far. We will not be truly successful or genuinely happy. We will not be real Buddhists, and we certainly won't be real jinists, real spiritual warriors. Okay. I'll leave it there, but do join us next week for another Sangharakshita classic, and thanks for listening. Just one little plug and then one other note, just to mention again the introductory course starting next week. So I'm leading that with Kavara D, an order member who normally teaches meditation on a Tuesday night, and you'll be introduced to the Metabhavana and mindfulness of breathing, but we'll also go through other aspects of the story and teachings like this. So easy to book online, 6 Mondays from next week. So do think about that. And then lastly, if you haven't given a donation already but you'd like to, the bowls will be at reception. We really appreciate anything you can give us. Yeah. But yeah, thanks very much for coming, and if you don't mind helping us put the stuff back to the sides, we'll leave it there.